It was a summer night, the kind that seems perfect for an outdoor adventure. 5 friends, Amanda, Mark, Sarah, Chris, and Emma, were looking forward to spending an exciting weekend at Wolf's Hollow Campground. Located in the heart of a dense and isolated forest, the camp was known for its dark stories and legends of hauntings, but this only added to the group's excitement. Amanda, the leader of the group, was an intrepid adventurer who was always looking for thrills. Mark was the funny adventurer, known for his jokes and scary stories. Sarah was the sensitive friend who liked to connect with nature, while Chris was the athlete, and Emma was the history student who had a special interest in urban legends and folklore. As they arrived at the camp, the sun set and the moon began to rise in the starry sky. The tranquil atmosphere of the forest was interrupted only by the sound of trees gently swaying in the wind. They set up their tents in a clearing near a stream and lit a fire, whose crackling light and inviting heat chased away the darkness of the night. As they talked and laughed around the campfire, Mark mentioned a local legend he had heard from a nearby resident. The spirit of an ancient woodcutter was said to haunt the forest, vengeful and thirsty for revenge. He explained that the woodcutter, called the Dark Woodcutter, had been wrongly accused of burning down the forest decades ago, and his tormented soul now wandered in the darkness, seeking justice. Amanda and Sarah laughed at Mark's stories, while Chris and Emma exchanged skeptical looks. However, a feeling of unease began to settle over the group, as if the forest was closely watching their every move. Even so, they attributed their nervousness to the excitement of the camp and decided to continue telling horror stories. As the night wore on and the campfire cast ominous shadows on the trees, the crescent moon illuminated the camp. The atmosphere became increasingly tense, and the initial excitement gave way to a feeling of uneasiness. They decided it was time to sleep, but the darkness of the forest seemed thicker than ever. As they entered their tents, the last thing Mark said before snuggling into his sleeping bag was, "I hope the Dark Woodsman doesn't come visit us tonight." The nervous laughter that followed couldn't hide the anxiety everyone felt deep in their hearts. And so, on the first night at Camp Wolf's Hollow, the group of friends fell asleep with the promise of exciting adventures and horror stories, never imagining that the forest's dark past and the legend of the Dark Woodsman would become a terrifying part of their own story. Amanda, Mark, Sarah, Chris, and Emma were all inside their tents, trying to fall asleep. However, the forest was far from quiet that night. The wind whispered eerily through the trees, and the nearby stream seemed to murmur unsettling secrets. As they struggled to fall asleep, a strange sound broke the silence of the night. It was as if someone was walking through the forest, stepping on dry leaves and breaking branches. Amanda lifted her head from her sleeping bag and frowned. She could hear Mark snoring softly in the tent next door, so it couldn't be him. Sarah was fast asleep, and Chris and Emma seemed equally disturbed by the sound. Deciding to investigate, Amanda left her tent and turned on a flashlight. She slowly walked towards the sound, following the sounds of footsteps that seemed to move away from her. The flashlight's light cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees around him. She could feel the invisible gazes of the forest as she advanced, and the atmosphere was charged with palpable tension. When Amanda reached the edge of the clearing, her eyes widened in surprise and fear. She saw a tall, shadowy figure moving through the trees. It was as if a specter was slowly walking towards her. Amanda held her breath, unable to move or scream in terror. The figure got closer, revealing the vague outlines of a man with a giant axe in his hands. Amanda's heart was beating so hard it felt like it was about to burst out of her chest. She finally managed to emit a deafening scream that woke up the others. Mark, Sarah, Chris, and Emma hurriedly exited their tents, stunned by the frightening sight before them. The figure of the woodcutter was there, raising the axe over his head, ready to attack. The group instinctively backed away, screaming in terror. It was then that the figure disappeared into the shadows, as if it had never been there. The forest became quiet again, and the only sound was the rapid rhythm of the friends' frightened breathing. They exchanged looks of confusion and fear, unable to explain what. They had just testified. Chris, the brave athlete, decided it was time to investigate. He took a flashlight and walked in the direction where the woodcutter had disappeared. The others followed closely, staying alert. They reached the area where they had seen the woodcutter, but there was no sign of him. Just tall trees, dancing shadows, and an unsettling silence. Chris shook his head and muttered, "It must have been my imagination. It can't be real." They returned to camp, but no one was able to relax or go back to sleep that night. The vision of the shadowy lumberjack would haunt their dreams and deepen the mystery surrounding Camp Wolf's Hollow. Little did they know that the worst was yet to come. Dawn came after a terrifying night at Camp Wolf's Hollow. The sunlight brought some relief to Amanda, Mark, Sarah, Chris, and Emma, as the darkness of the night seemed less threatening in its light. However, they were still scared and determined to discover the truth behind the shadowy woodcutter. As they ate breakfast around the campfire, they discussed what they had seen the night before. Some believed there was a rational explanation for the phenomenon, such as an optical illusion or a local resident playing with them. But everyone agreed that the fear they felt was very real. They decided to explore the forest during the day to find clues to the shadowy woodcutter's identity. Mark, the most skeptical of the group, led the expedition, while the others followed closely behind. Sunlight bathed the forest, and everything seemed peaceful. As they walked, Mark started making jokes to ease the tension. However, his tone trembled slightly, and he seemed more nervous than he cared to admit. Sarah was busy examining the trees and terrain for clues, while Chris and Emma discussed local legends and woodcutter stories. That's when they found an old abandoned campsite, not far from the spot where they had seen the shadowy woodcutter the night before. The area was covered in fallen leaves and moss, and there were remnants of a long-extinct campfire. Emma noticed something strange on the floor. It was a wooden nameplate, weathered and weathered, with the name Arthur Mitchell Lumberjack engraved on it. The friends crouched down to take a closer look and noticed that there were more objects scattered around the camp, including a faded photo of a man with an axe. As they investigated, a feeling that they were being watched returned to the group. Amanda turned suddenly and saw a tall, dark shadow between the trees. It was the dark woodcutter, standing with his giant axe in his hand. This time, they didn't hesitate to flee. They ran back to camp as fast as they could, with the shadowy woodcutter following closely behind. The forest seemed to close in around them, as if they were trapped in a nightmare. Amanda and her friends finally arrived at the camp and entered their tents, praying that the woodcutter wouldn't catch up to them. They could hear the heavy footsteps and the creak of breaking branches as the woodcutter approached. Amanda, her heart in her throat, peered through the opening of the tent and saw the shadowy figure stand outside. The dark woodcutter seemed to be watching them, as if he was waiting for something. For an agonizing moment, they stared at each other through the thin fabric wall of the tent. Then, without warning, the shadowy woodcutter disappeared once again into the shadows of the forest. The group was safe for now, but they knew the nightmare was far from over. The lumberjack's identity and the reason for his pursuit remained a terrifying mystery that they were determined to solve. The day passed slowly as Amanda, Mark, Sarah, Chris, and Emma remained in their tents, waiting for night to fall. The vision of the shadowy woodcutter still haunted their thoughts, and they knew they needed to find a way to escape the forest before it was too late. As soon as darkness fell, they decided it was time to leave the camp and look for help. Amanda, who was the most determined of the group, led the way. With flashlights in hand, they moved silently through the forest, trying to make as little noise as possible. Every sound, every broken branch, and every whisper of the wind made their hearts beat faster. They knew that the shadowy woodcutter might be somewhere nearby, watching them from the shadows. As they advanced, they came to an area of the forest that looked different. The trees were taller and denser, and the darkness was more intense. It was as if they had entered a dark and unknown realm. It was then that they began to hear a distant sound, a sound that stopped them in their tracks. It was the sound of axes chopping wood. Eyes wide, they looked at each other, knowing that they were alone in the forest. He couldn't be a real woodcutter, they thought. It was impossible considering how remote the campsite was. The sounds continued, getting closer and closer, and a feeling of panic began to set in. They grabbed their flashlights and decided to investigate, reluctant but determined to discover the source of the disturbing noises. As they advanced, the forest seemed to close in around them, as if they were entering a maze of ancient trees. The darkness was oppressive, and the sounds of axes chopping wood grew louder. Finally, they arrived at a clearing in the heart of the forest. In the center of the clearing, there was a decrepit wooden hut covered in moss and cobwebs. A rusty axe was stuck in the tree next to the cabin. It was a scene straight from a nightmare. With hearts racing, they decided to enter the cabin, desperately wanting to find answers. The interior was dark and damp, with dusty furniture and yellowed portraits on the walls. An aura of abandonment hung in the air, but there was something more. Something sinister. As they explored the rooms, they found a dusty diary on a table. It was the diary of the woodcutter, Arthur Mitchell, which detailed his descent into madness and his desire for revenge against those who had destroyed the forest he loved so much. The last page was stained with blood. Terrified, they heard heavy footsteps approaching the cabin. The woodcutter, or whatever he was approaching. They grabbed the diary and ran out of the cabin without looking back. Hearts pounding wildly, they ran through the dark forest, following narrow trails and dodging ancient trees. The sound of axes chopping wood echoed in their ears, and they knew they were being pursued. Finally, after a desperate scramble, they emerged from the forest and reached the road. A car passed by, and they signaled desperately. The driver stopped and took them to the safety of the nearest town. That night, they told their story to the police, but no one could find evidence of the cabin or the vengeful woodcutter. The forest of Wolf's Hollow held its dark secrets, and they had narrowly escaped a terrifying night they would never forget. The identity of the shadowy woodsman and the fate of Arthur Mitchell remained shrouded in mystery, but they knew they had faced something beyond human understanding.